Welcome back, disciples. I hope your time with those 5 prayers from St. Augustine's Confessions was well spent. I hope you found 2 or 3 of them touched you in a powerful way, and that you've just finished up a conversation that was open and honest and full of the Spirit. Now I can reveal which 2 sentences in those prayers are 2 of the most famous lines Augustine ever wrote. If you haven't already picked them out, they are the last line of the first prayer: "You have made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And the first line of the last prayer: "Late have I loved you, beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you." I think it's worth reminding ourselves that Confessions is not Augustine's diary. He wrote it when he was 40 or 45 years old, which was 10 years after he gave his life to Jesus and 8 years after his baptism. He had already settled his opinion of his past life. He had already spent years in prayer with God, reviewing his life and discovering God in it everywhere, even when Augustine himself was farthest away from God. So all these 5 prayers you read last week, the 2 from Book 1 and the 3 from Book 10, were all already planned out in Augustine's mind when he wrote them. His whole past, as sinner, convert, and now church official, are already contained in each prayer, even though in the narrative of the book he's writing, those life events may not have happened yet. Now let's finally start getting to know the man himself. Today, I'm giving you a bird's eye view of Augustine's full life story and all the kinds of writings he produced. Future videos will dive much deeper into each period of Augustine's life and each genre of his works. This video is just meant to orient you, so you have a rough idea of where in Augustine's biography each future video is going to fit. Augustine was born in the year 354. In what is now Algeria, northern Africa. His father was a town councilman and a pagan. His mother Monica was a devout Christian, but she didn't insist on her son being baptized at an early age. He had 1 brother and 2 sisters. He was a very intelligent child, but a total slacker in grammar school. He fell in love with the great Roman epics and speeches by great orators like Cicero in middle school. And at 16, he moved to the local capital, Carthage, for his upper schooling. He was already a pretty vain and ego-driven young man back at home, and had already had his first taste of sex. In Carthage, with no parental restraints, he threw himself into the lustful and bloodthirsty pleasure of the big city, like the theaters and the circuses and all the sex he could get. But by the time he was 19 or 20, Augustine had settled down significantly. He had a common law wife that he absolutely adored, and a son who, like all toddlers, was his headache. He had settled into his studies, become one of the city's leading public intellectuals, and was always networking for a more prestigious imperial post or a professorship in one of the major imperial cities. And he was still a probing young man, and though he thought Christianity was embarrassingly simple-minded and unworthy of an intellectual like himself, he did want to attach himself to a religion that explained the order and nature of things. For many years, he was a junior member of the religion Manichaeism, which his mother Monica considered a cult. In many aspects of her son's life, she tried to walk the line between encouraging him to put aside all his sins and vices and come back to Christianity, while not nagging or overstepping his boundaries. Augustine didn't see it that way, and snuck onto a boat to Rome in the middle of the night with his partner and son to get away from her. A year after he moved to Italy, Augustine finally got the call he'd been angling for. A summons from the regional imperial capital in Milan to join the emperor's team of spokesmen. His mother followed him to Rome, and to Milan, where she enlisted the help of the local Christian bishop, Ambrose, who was extremely learned, to show her son that Christianity was an intellectually viable option for him. And Ambrose succeeded, where nobody else had. Augustine very quickly came to accept the Christian worldview. But it would be 3 more years before he could let go of his vices and sinful habits and finally give both his mind and his body to God. One late afternoon in 386, when he was 31 years old, Augustine had a nervous breakdown, into which God finally intervened directly and gave him a miraculous nudge toward exactly the Bible passage he needed to see to free him from the chains of his vices. The next spring, he was baptized by Ambrose, with his mother present to see her dreams fulfilled. Less than 2 months later, just about to return home to Algeria with her Christian son, Monica died. Augustine saw his professional life, his careerism and ambition, as sure hindrances to his spiritual growth, and retired to the countryside outside his hometown to live a kind of monasticism with his dearest Christian friends. He lost his 11-year-old son to illness during this time. He deeply resisted any connection to church life in the local towns and cities, for fear that his reputation as an intellectual and public speaker would lure him into religious offices that would tempt him back to a life of ambition and vanity. Of course, those things happened to him anyway. On a visit to the harbor town of Hippo Regius, the Christian assembly there practically forced him into priestly ordination, and in 395, the aging bishop took the unusual step of ordaining Augustine his assistant bishop, to take over the day-to-day tasks of preaching and teaching. Augustine wrote his autobiography, Confessions, in part to convince those locals who had known Augustine's past and his reputation that he really had changed and would not disgrace the name of bishop. From then on, from his consecration at the age of 41 until his death in the year 430 at age 76, Augustine remained the bishop of Hippo. His dearest friend and partner in conversion became the Bishop of Carthage, the provincial capital, and so Augustine did travel there frequently to participate in synods of bishops and coordinate with imperial officials, and of course, to see his dear friend. But apart from that, he remained devoted to his local flock. Except for 8 early treatises from his monastic years, all of his extant writings date from his priesthood and episcopate in Hippo. We have 559 of the occasional sermons he preached, not counting his longer sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount, the writings of John, and all 150 Psalms. He wrote a commentary on Matthew and on Romans, at least 4 on the first chapters of Genesis, and a treatise on how to harmonize variant versions of events in the Synoptic Gospels. He wrote about 15 occasional treatises on certain moral themes, handbooks for deacons and catechists on how to present the faith to newcomers, and many, many argumentative works against the major local heresies of his day. His longest and most famous treatises are The Trinity, 15 books about the right understanding of the divine relationships and their implications for humans being made in God's image, and The City of God, 22 even longer books about the failures of Roman pagan society and the coexistence of worldly evils and Christian sainthood in the world today. During this time, he lived through the sack of Rome in the year 410, and the arrival in Africa of refugees who brought new varieties of Christian practice with them, some of which he considered heresies. When he turned 70, he began to revisit his published works and comment on what he now disagreed with in his Retractions, also a first-of-its-kind work. As he lay dying in the years 429 and 430, the Germanic nation called the Vandals had already swept through northern Europe and Spain, and were on the march through North Africa, quite literally at the gates of the town of Hippo. All right, now to set up this week's reading for you. I've chosen one of the most famous vignettes from Augustine's autobiography, Confessions. It's your first taste of Augustine's writing style in that book in longer form. We're going to read the first great example of Augustine taking a single memory from his past, looking at it from multiple angles, and diagnosing his spiritual sickness. It's the story of the pear tree. One night, when he was 15 or 16, he and his friends climbed over the wall into a neighbor's garden, shook some pears off the trees, and ran off with them. Now, you and I might think that's bad behavior, but it can't be the worst sin he committed, even in just that year, from the way he describes who he was as a teenager. And Augustine would agree with us, it wasn't. It's precisely that aspect of it, how mundane a sin this was, that sets him thinking. And you will be amazed at where Augustine goes in this thought process of dissecting this event and laying himself bare. So first, spend some time here and now in conversation. Is there anything in this video that sheds new light on the prayers you read last week? Does this description of Augustine's life story put his prayers into a clearer context? What are your first thoughts about the dizzying range of his life and his writings? Then at the end of the session, your facilitator will pass out the pear tree reading. I've already erased a bunch of his even more digressing digressions for you so that you can zero in on what Augustine is saying about that incident. As you read, take note of why Augustine ultimately decides he took part in that sin. What were his motivations? What was not his motivation that you might have expected it to be? Does he blame others for his sin? Does he pin it all on his own brokenness? Or something in between? Do you have any memories from your childhood or adolescence that stand out to you like the pear tree does to him? Can you take at least the first steps to analyze that memory of yours the way he has? And what will you find there? Until next week, peace and all good.